Hi, my name is Samantha Brennan. I'm Dean of the College of Arts at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, where I'm also a professor of philosophy. I'm the author of the paper Feminist Philosophers Turn Their Thoughts to Death, and I'm talking to you about why I wrote that paper and what interests I still have in the questions related to feminism and death. I wrote the paper originally because I was teaching a large undergraduate class on philosophy and death, and I was struck almost immediately by the lack of work by feminists on the topic. And it's an interesting gap in the literature just because the view that most philosophers land on is that death is bad insofar it's bad because it takes away the goods of life. And we also have this view, well, it's true, it's not just a view, that men and women tend to lead radically different lives and have different goods in their lives. And if death is bad insofar as it takes the goods of life away, then it might make a difference what kind of goods are in your life. Some feminist philosophers began to wonder if certain kinds of goods are more resilient to the deprivation of death. That is, if they're the kinds of things that it doesn't matter how long you have them, it's just enough that you have them, and they're not time dependent. If you've studied utilitarianism, you know the view that happiness is a good thing and more happiness is always better. It's the kind of experience there's never any reason not to want more. If something is good, more is better. But that's not true with some of life's goods. Some of life's goods, like achieving a good character or having deep, meaningful relationships, some people think moments of oneness with nature, the kind of experiences we have in the natural world, are the kind of experiences like you're at the top of the, you've climbed the mountain, you're at the top of the mountain. Doesn't matter how long you stay. You're there for 2 minutes, you're there for 2 hours. It doesn't really matter. And so, or you have a wonderful relationship, and the goods of that relationship aren't necessarily time dependent. Or you have achieved certain kinds of things in your life, and once you've achieved them, and death doesn't take those achievements away. So the feminist thought here is that the utilitarian picture of life just being composed of additive goods, where more is always better, also leads to a kind of gloomy view about death, because death will always be the end of things, and you could have always had more, and for most of us, more would have been valuable. But that's not true of the kind of lives that lots of us lead. And feminist philosophers thought maybe some of the feminist literature on well being is relevant to our thinking about the badness of death. I'm still interested in that question. The question now that interests me the most is this idea of, do men and women, how to think about inequality in terms of men and women's lives. So, on the one hand, that poses the very traditional problem where women have longer lives, but the end of our lives tend to be less good. Um, so maybe we have more good overall, but the last bit brings down the average. Um, but it also, so there's the kind of how do we count question. Is it the average or is it the total? And how do we think about extra years at the end that aren't particularly good? The other question is whether or not the feminist critique about well being leads us to make different judgments about the kinds of lives that men and women typically lead. Um, so, for example, feminist theories of well being place a high value on relationships and relationship goods, and men's lives typically don't have as many of those relationships goods. That is your standard pattern of uh, masculine normative achievement um, doesn't have those goods. When we talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about a version of the male life that's missing certain of those goods, say friendship. Men are often more represented among certain kinds of depression and mental illness. Again, some people think because of the lack of connection with other people. So that's an interesting question also about um, the ways in which women's lives, we tend to think about feminists thinking that women always have it worse off, but in some ways, feminist literature on well being suggests it's men who, in certain respects, lead worse lives. So those are the two questions I'm still interested in and still writing about, and I'm giving up some. I was going to be giving talks this summer on a couple of those topics, but now I'm not, thanks COVID-19. Um, you asked also whether or not my work is relevant to COVID-19, and I got thinking about the view that we don't need to worry so much about COVID-19 because it's just people in care homes and nursing homes that die. If you start looking at the gender, although in younger ages men are more vulnerable to COVID-19, overall in North America and Canada, where I am, most of the people who've died have been women because they're overrepresented in nursing homes and care homes where the majority of deaths have taken place. And there's a tendency to say or to think that those lives don't matter, that they aren't so important. Um, and I think that's definitely gendered and definitely related to a kind of sexism and ageism that run together. It's also true that the other group of people who have been affected by COVID-19 are people who work in those care homes, who are often recent immigrants to Canada, um, racialized women. Women are overrepresented again in the care workers in the care homes where the majority of deaths have taken place. So that's two. That's some ways in which my work is connected to COVID-19. Who's dying and how much do we care and how much do those lives matter? Um, Thanks very much for reading my paper. If you have questions about my paper, I'm an academic administrator these days dealing a lot with reports and forms, and I'm always happy to get email from students about my work. Send me a message. I'm happy to talk about philosophy anytime. Thanks so much. Bye.